Will you marry me? Get up, wife. Let's go home.
Oak Haven Whispers, said Adrian McCoy, kept the bones of trespassers on his porch. He was a scarred, towering ghost of the Rockies, a man civilized society abandoned. Yet, standing in the freezing mud, a desperate woman looked him dead in his cold eyes and asked for his hand. The Colorado Territory in the winter of 1879 was unforgiving to anyone, but it was exceptionally cruel to a woman left entirely alone. Rachel Beaumont stood by the frosted window of her family's deteriorating homestead, pulling a moth-eaten woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. Outside, the mining town of Oak Haven was a smudge of gray smoke and churning brown mud against the pristine, jagged teeth of the Rocky Mountains. Rachel's father, Elias Beaumont, had been a good man, but a terrible businessman. When the consumption finally took him to an early grave 3 weeks prior, he left Rachel with nothing but a sprawling, timber-rich plot of land at the base of the mountains and a staggering debt of $800. The note was held by Jeremiah Bancroft. Bancroft was the rot at the core of Oak Haven. He owned the bank, the assay office, and half the town council. He was a man who spoke in polite, venomous murmurs, wearing fine Eastern suits while his hired thugs broke the fingers of indebted miners in the alleyways. Bancroft didn't just want Elias's money, he wanted the Beaumont land to expand his logging empire. More than that, he wanted Rachel as a trophy. Just that morning, Bancroft had stood in Rachel's parlor, his heavy cologne masking the scent of stale whiskey, and delivered his ultimatum. "The sheriff will be serving the eviction papers by Friday, Rachel," Bancroft had said, tracing a gloved finger along the back of her father's favorite armchair. "Unless, of course, you accept my proposal. Become Mrs. Bancroft. Your debts vanish, you keep the house, and you'll never know hunger again. If you refuse, I will throw you into the snow with only the clothes on your back. A woman like you won't last a week in the saloons, let alone the winter." She had 3 days. Rachel had gone to Doc Abernathy, an old friend of her father's, but the aging physician could only offer her $20 and a tearful apology, terrified of crossing Bancroft. Sheriff Caleb Miller had practically locked his office door when he saw her coming. The town had collectively turned its back on her, abandoning her to the wolves. As Rachel watched the snow begin to fall from her window, a heavy silence fell over the main street below. The clamor of the blacksmith's hammer ceased. The saloon doors swung shut and stayed that way. Through the flurries, a solitary figure rode into town. It was Adrian McCoy. He came down from the high peaks of Blackwood Ridge only twice a year to trade furs for salt, coffee, and gunpowder at Arthur Penhaligon's general store. Adrian was a mountain man, a relic of a wilder, bloodier era. He rode a massive, dark roan draft horse, and 2 terrifyingly large wolf-dog hybrids trotted at his stirrups. He was a mountain of a man, draped in heavy grizzly furs and weathered leather. A Winchester rifle rested casually across his saddle horn. The town of Oak Haven held its breath when McCoy was near. 3 years ago, a gang of 5 ruthless rustlers led by a man named Black Jack Holden had made the fatal mistake of stealing horses and hiding out near McCoy's claim. A week later, Sheriff Miller found all 5 men stacked like cordwood at the edge of town, their camp entirely destroyed. Adrian had walked into the sheriff's office, dropped the men's bloody bounties on the desk, and walked out without saying a single word. He was scarred, reclusive, and utterly lethal. Rachel watched from her window as Bancroft, who had been strutting out of the bank, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. The wealthy, powerful man practically flattened himself against the wooden boardwalk to give Adrian a wide berth, visibly trembling as the mountain man's cold, pale eyes swept over him. Bancroft, who feared neither God nor the law, was terrified of Adrian McCoy. In that fleeting second, staring down at the muddy street, an insane, desperate spark ignited in Rachel's mind. The property laws of the territory were archaic but clear. If a woman married, all her property, assets, and debts transferred legally to her husband. If Rachel married, Bancroft would no longer be dealing with a helpless orphan. He would have to collect the debt and the land from her husband, and Jeremiah Bancroft would rather walk barefoot through hell then knock on Adrian McCoy's door to collect a debt. It was a suicidal thought. The town gossips claimed Adrian had gone mad from the isolation, that he lived like an animal, that he was more beast than man. But Rachel looked around her freezing, empty house. She thought of Bancroft's sweaty hands on her waist. The alternative to madness was subjugation to a monster she already knew. Rachel turned away from the window and began to pack a small satchel. She was going to climb Blackwood Ridge. The trail up Blackwood Ridge was less of a road and more of a suggestion carved by elk and runoff. Rachel had borrowed a stubborn, gray mule named Barnaby from Doc Abernathy under the guise of visiting a distant cousin in the neighboring valley. The doctor, relieved to be free of her presence, didn't question her. The ascent took 6 agonizing hours. The temperature dropped steadily the higher she climbed, the dense pine canopy blocking out the pale winter sun. The wind howled through the granite canyons, biting at her exposed cheeks and tearing through her meager wool coat. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Rachel's hands went numb, clutching the leather reins until her knuckles were white. By the time she reached the plateau where Adrian was rumored to live, the afternoon light was dying, bleeding a bruised purple across the horizon. Her lungs burned from the thin altitude. The smell of raw pine, damp earth, and finally, the sharp, distinct scent of wood smoke filled the air. Adrian McCoy's cabin was a fortress built into the side of the mountain. It was constructed of massive, unpeeled logs, its roof heavy with sod and snow. A wide porch held racks of stretching animal hides and stacks of split firewood that reached the eaves. Before Rachel could even dismount, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the clearing. The 2 massive wolf dogs emerged from the shadows beneath the porch, their yellow eyes fixed on her, teeth bared. Barnaby the mule panicked, bucking wildly. Rachel was thrown from the saddle, landing hard in the freezing, packed snow. She gasped, the wind knocked out of her, as the dogs advanced. Heel. The voice was like stones grinding together in a riverbed deep, rough, and entirely unused to pleasantries. The dogs stopped instantly, dropping to their bellies. Rachel pushed herself up onto her elbows, her dress soaked and freezing against her skin. Standing on the porch, a double-barrel shotgun resting effortlessly in the crook of his arm, was Adrian McCoy. Up close, he was even more terrifying. He had removed his heavy furs, wearing a thick wool shirt and suspenders over a broad, muscular frame. A jagged, silver scar tore across his jawline and disappeared into a thick, dark beard. His eyes, the color of winter ice, locked onto her. There was no surprise in them, only a cold, calculating suspicion. "You're lost, girl," Adrian said, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "Town's down the mountain. Ride back before it gets dark." Rachel stood up, her knee trembling from the cold and the sheer adrenaline coursing through her veins. She brushed the snow from her skirt and forced herself to look him in the eye. "I am exactly where I intended to be, Mr. McCoy," Rachel said. Her voice shook, but she forced it louder. "I am Rachel Beaumont, and I have come to speak with you." Adrian didn't lower the shotgun. He stared at her, assessing her frail coat, her pale, shivering face, and the desperate set of her jaw. "Speak." "Not out here," Rachel replied, wrapping her arms around herself. "I'm freezing. If I freeze to death on your property, Sheriff Miller will have to come up here to collect the body, and I know how much you despise company." A flicker of something, perhaps faint amusement, or just surprise at her audacity, crossed Adrian's scarred face. He stepped aside, leaving the heavy oak door open. 5 minutes. Then you ride back down. Rachel stepped into the cabin. It was incredibly warm, heated by a massive stone hearth that dominated the far wall. It smelled of tanned leather, strong coffee, and gun oil. It was austere, but immaculately clean. Adrian closed the door behind her, plunging the room into the amber glow of the firelight. He leaned his shotgun against the wall and crossed his massive arms. "Clock's ticking, Miss Beaumont." Rachel stood by the fire, letting the heat thaw her frozen limbs. She didn't have time to be coy. She had to lay all her cards on the table. "My father died 3 weeks ago," Rachel began, her voice steadying. "He left me a deed to the Lower Valley timberlands. He also left me an $800 debt to Jeremiah Bancroft. Bancroft is calling the note due. He told me I could either marry him and surrender the land to his logging company, or he would throw me into the streets to freeze. Adrian's expression remained entirely impassive. Tragic. Not my problem. Go cry to the law. The law in Oakhaven belongs to Bancroft, Rachel shot back, taking a step toward him. You know that. You know how Bancroft operates. He wants my land because it borders yours. Once he strips the lower valley, his loggers will push up the mountain. They'll pollute your river, clear-cut your hunting grounds, and bring hundreds of men up Blackwood Ridge. That made Adrian narrow his eyes. The muscle in his scarred jaw ticked. Bancroft brings his men up here. They'll leave in pine boxes. Maybe, Rachel said, her heart hammering against her ribs. But they'll keep coming. Bancroft is rich, and he is relentless. Unless the land is protected by someone he fears more than he loves money. Adrian stared at her, the silence stretching so taut it felt like it might snap. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. And what exactly are you proposing, little girl? Rachel lifted her chin. She looked at this massive, dangerous man, a killer, an outcast, a ghost, and laid down her life. I am proposing a business transaction, Rachel said, her voice ringing clear in the quiet cabin. Marry me. By law, my father's deed transfers to you. Bancroft's loggers can never touch the lower valley. You keep your mountain isolated forever. Adrian let out a low, humorless sound that might have been a laugh. And what do you get out of this deal? Half my furs? A quiet place to knit? Protection, Rachel said fiercely. Bancroft will inherit my debt, but he will have to come to you to collect it. And I saw him in town today. He is terrified of you. He would rather burn his own bank down than knock on this door demanding money from Adrian McCoy. I get to live, Mr. McCoy. That is all I want. I will cook, I will clean, I will mend your clothes, and I will stay out of your way. A marriage in name only. Adrian didn't move. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He walked slowly toward her. Rachel held her ground, refusing to flinch as he stopped mere inches away. He was a foot taller than her, his presence suffocatingly large. He looked down at her, searching her eyes for deception, for hysteria, for any sign of a trap. He found only raw, unflinching desperation. You're asking a man you don't know, a man they call a butcher, to take you as a wife, Adrian murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. You think Bancroft is a monster? You have no idea what lives up here in the dark. I would rather take my chances with the monsters in the dark than the ones hiding in plain sight, Rachel answered, her voice trembling just slightly. Will you do it? The wind howled fiercely outside, rattling the heavy wooden shutters of the cabin. Adrian held her gaze for what felt like an eternity. He looked at her frostbitten hands, the resolute set of her shoulders, and the unyielding fire in her eyes. He turned away, walking toward the heavy oak door. He pulled it open, letting the freezing mountain storm swirl into the room. Rachel's heart plummeted. He was throwing her out. Adrian looked over his shoulder at her. Pack your winter coat. The descent into Oakhaven the following morning was a silent, freezing march through a world painted entirely in brutal shades of white and gray. Rachel rode Barnaby the stubborn mule, her slender frame entirely swallowed by the massive, heavy buffalo hide coat Adrian had tossed her before dawn. Ahead of her, Adrian rode his giant roan draft horse, casting a long, imposing shadow that seemed to swallow the sunlit snowdrifts. Rachel's mind raced with the sheer, unadulterated madness of what she was doing. Every crunch of the mule's hooves on the packed ice was a step closer to binding herself to a killer, a man the entire territory spoke of in terrified whispers. Yet, as she watched the steady, immovable breadth of Adrian's shoulders ahead of her, she felt a strange, terrifying calm. She was choosing her monster. When they finally crossed the invisible threshold of the town limits, Oakhaven didn't just quiet down. It practically stopped breathing. The rhythmic, metallic clang of the blacksmith's hammer ceased mid-swing. Arthur Penhaligon, hauling a heavy burlap sack of cornmeal up the wooden steps of his general store, froze so abruptly that the sack slipped from his thick fingers, bursting into a yellow, dusty cloud on the boardwalk. The swinging doors of the Golden Nugget Saloon swung shut and stayed motionless. Even the stray hounds that normally fought over butcher scraps scurried underneath the raised foundations of the buildings, whining low in their throats. Adrian McCoy did not come to town with a woman in tow. In fact, Adrian McCoy did not come to town unless blood was owed. Adrian ignored the terrified, wide-eyed stares burning into them from behind dirty glass windows. He steered his massive horse directly toward the imposing brick facade of the district courthouse, halting in the center of the muddy thoroughfare. He swung down from his saddle with a heavy thud, his silver spurs jingling sharply in the dead silence. Walking to Rachel's mule, he grasped her by the waist and lifted her down with an effortless, terrifying strength that made her breath hitch. "Keep your head up," Adrian muttered, his voice a low gravel that barely carried over the crunch of the snow beneath their boots. "You look like prey. They'll treat you like prey. Walk tall." Rachel swallowed hard, stiffening her spine and lifting her chin as she walked beside the giant of a man into the courthouse. They entirely bypassed the crowded waiting area, ignoring the squawking protests of a junior clerk, and pushed directly into the private, mahogany-paneled chambers of Judge Ezekiel Hammond. Hammond was a weary, whiskey-soaked territorial judge appointed by the governor himself. He was infamous locally for rubber-stamping Jeremiah Bancroft's ruthless land grabs in exchange for a quiet, highly lucrative life. Hammond nearly choked on his morning cigar when Adrian's massive frame filled the doorway, blocking out the light from the hall. "McCoy," Hammond stammered, scrambling to his feet so fast he knocked over a heavy brass inkwell, sending black ink pooling across his pristine ledgers. To what do I owe this visit? There's no bounty out right now. No trouble in the high passes, I assure you." "Ain't here for blood, Judge," Adrian said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. He stepped aside just enough to reveal Rachel standing resolute in his shadow. "We're here for a marriage license. And a ceremony. Right now." Judge Hammond's bloodshot eyes darted frantically between the scarred, heavily armed mountain man and the pale, trembling daughter of Elias Beaumont. The gears in the corrupt judge's head turned rapidly. Oak Haven was a small town. Everyone, especially Hammond, knew Bancroft's deadline for Rachel's massive debt was tomorrow at noon. "Now, see here, Adrian," Hammond said, sweating profusely and dabbing his brow with a silk handkerchief. "This is highly irregular. Miss Beaumont is. Well, she is currently embroiled in a complex civil dispute regarding her late father's estate. Mr. Bancroft holds the paper." "Territorial property law of 1861, Adrian interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, echoing dangerously off the dark wood walls. "A woman's property, her land deeds, and her financial debts transfer in totality to her legal husband upon the consummation of vows." "You gonna stand there and tell me the territorial law doesn't apply to me, Hammond?" No, of course not, but I must insist." The heavy oak doors of the chamber slammed open with a violent crash. Jeremiah Bancroft stood in the threshold, his chest heaving, flanked by Sheriff Caleb Miller and two heavily armed deputies with their hands hovering over their holsters. Bancroft's face was an apoplectic mask of pure rage. One of his spies had tipped him off the second Adrian and Rachel rode past the livery. "Stop this immediately," Bancroft hissed, his tailored Eastern suit looking pristine and absurd against the grim reality of the room. He pointed a trembling, leather-gloved finger directly at Rachel. "This is blatant fraud. She is attempting to evade a lawful, documented debt." "She ain't evading nothing," Adrian said. He didn't turn around. He didn't flinch. He didn't even reach for the heavy Colt revolver strapped low on his thigh or the hunting knife at his belt. He simply shifted his weight, his broad shoulders tensing beneath his wool shirt, and the two deputies behind the sheriff instinctively took a synchronized step backward, their bravado evaporating into the stale air. Adrian slowly turned his head to look at Bancroft, his icy eyes pinning the wealthy banker to the spot. "The debt is $800. Draw up the paper, Bancroft. Transfer the damn note to my name. You want your money, you come up Blackwood Ridge and ask me for it yourself." The silence in the room became absolute, thick enough to choke on. Bancroft's jaw worked soundlessly. The nearby Leadville silver boom was devouring lumber at an unprecedented, frantic rate, and Bancroft desperately needed the Beaumont Valley timber to secure a massive railroad contract that would make him a millionaire. But looking into the dead, predatory eyes of Adrian McCoy, Bancroft saw only his own violent mortality. He remembered the 5 rustlers Adrian had slaughtered 3 years ago, left stacked like cordwood for the sheriff to find. "Sheriff," Bancroft snapped, his voice cracking with a mix of fury and raw terror. "Arrest this man for intimidation and threatening a prominent citizen. Sheriff Miller, a man who survived this brutal frontier by knowing exactly who not to cross, swallowed hard and kept his hands well away from his gun belt. Mr. Bancroft. He ain't broke a single law. If they want to marry, I can't stop 'em. I won't stop 'em." Bancroft sneered, his face turning an ugly, mottled shade of plum. He looked at Rachel, his eyes filled with pure, unadulterated venom. "You think you've won, you stupid, naive little girl? You think tying yourself to a rabid dog will save your land? He'll kill you before the winter is out, and I'll take the land from his frozen corpse. Do it, Judge." "Now," Adrian commanded, ignoring Bancroft entirely and returning his piercing gaze to Hammond. Trembling violently, Judge Hammond opened his official ledger. He rushed through the standard vows, his voice a frantic, breathless whisper, desperate to get the giant out of his office. Rachel's hands shook so violently she could barely hold them steady at her sides, but then Adrian's massive, calloused hand reached out and firmly engulfed hers. His grip was surprisingly warm, grounding her, acting as a heavy iron anchor in the swirling storm of her terror. "Do you, Adrian McCoy, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Hammond rushed out. "I do." The 2 words were heavy, immovable granite. "And do you, Rachel Beaumont, take this man?" Rachel looked back at Bancroft's furious, defeated face, then looked up at the scarred, towering man beside her who had just placed himself between her and ruin. She squeezed his rough hand. "I do." Hammond violently stamped the paper with his heavy brass seal. "By the power vested in me by the Colorado Territory, I pronounce you man and wife." Adrian released her hand. He turned fully to face Bancroft, closing the distance between them in 2 long, predatory strides. Bancroft stumbled backward in panic, his back hitting the hard wooden doorframe. "The Beaumont land is McCoy land now," Adrian whispered, his voice carrying the lethal, unstoppable promise of a falling mountain avalanche. "You send your loggers into my valley, I will hunt them for sport. You send your deputies, I will bury them deep. You breathe a single word of disrespect toward my wife, and I will come to your house in the dark, Jeremiah. Do we understand each other?" Bancroft couldn't speak. He simply gave a frantic, jerky nod, his face drained of all color. Adrian turned, grabbed Rachel's worn satchel, and placed his heavy, warm hand on the small of her back, guiding her out of the suffocating courthouse and back into the freezing air. The deed was done. The cornered doe had just married the wolf, and the town of Oakhaven would never be the same. The first 3 weeks on Blackwood Ridge were a masterclass in suffocating silence. True to his word, Adrian demanded nothing of Rachel. He surrendered his heavy timber bed to her, choosing instead to sleep on a pallet of bearskins before the massive stone hearth. He left before dawn to check his trap lines, returning only when the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. Rachel threw herself into the relentless chores of mountain survival. She chopped kindling, hauled water from the half-frozen creek, and learned to cook venison and salt pork over an open flame. The work was brutal, cracking her hands and exhausting her muscles, but it was accompanied by a profound, unfamiliar peace. No one was coming to evict her. No one was looking at her with Bancroft's predatory hunger. Slowly, the terrifying beast of Oakhaven began to reveal fractures of humanity. One evening, while cleaning the dust from the high shelves, Rachel knocked over a small, wooden cigar box. It hit the floorboards, bursting open. Instead of tobacco, out spilled a collection of worn, leather-bound books and a heavy, tarnished brass medal. Rachel knelt, picking up the heavy medallion. It bore the insignia of the 1st Colorado Cavalry, dated 1862. Beside it was a worn copy of Homer's Iliad in its original Greek, the margins filled with neat, precise handwriting. "You shouldn't go through a man's things." Rachel jumped, dropping the book. Adrian was standing in the doorway, snow dusting his broad shoulders, a brace of dead rabbits hanging from his gloved hand. He looked at the spilled box. "I'm sorry," Rachel stammered, scrambling to gather the items. "I was just dusting. I didn't mean to pry." Adrian walked over, setting the rabbits on the table. He knelt beside her, his massive frame dwarfing hers. He gently took the brass medal from her hands. "Battle of Glorieta Pass," Adrian said quietly, his thumb rubbing the tarnished metal. "Long time ago, another life." "You read Greek," Rachel noted, gesturing to the book. "My father was a schoolmaster in Pennsylvania before the war," Adrian replied, placing the items back in the box with surprising reverence. "Taught me the classics before he taught me to shoot. Found out later that shooting keeps you alive a hell of a lot longer than poetry." He stood up, taking the box and placing it back on the shelf. For a moment, the heavy silence between them wasn't hostile. It was just sad. "Your hands are bleeding," Adrian observed, looking at her cracked, overworked knuckles. Before she could pull away, he took her hands in his. From a shelf, he retrieved a tin of pungent bear grease and beeswax. With agonizing gentleness, the man rumored to be a ruthless butcher worked the salve into her torn skin. His calluses scraped against hers, but the touch was the kindest thing she had felt since her father died. Rachel looked up at his scarred face, the harsh lines softened by the firelight. "Why did you agree to this, Adrian? To marry me. You didn't need the land." Adrian didn't meet her eyes. He kept his focus on her hands. "A man gets tired of the quiet, Rachel, even if he tells himself he ain't." The tentative peace shattered 2 days later, brought down by the arrival of a blinding, roaring December blizzard. The wind shrieked like a dying animal against the log walls, driving a wall of white snow that reduced visibility to zero. They were entirely cut off from the world, which was exactly what Jeremiah Bancroft had been counting on. It happened just after midnight. Tracker and Bone, the two wolf dogs, suddenly leaped to their feet, their hackles raised, unleashing a chorus of savage, deafening barks toward the heavy oak door. Adrian was off his pallet in a heartbeat. He didn't speak. He grabbed his Winchester repeating rifle and blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into the dim, flickering shadows of the dying fire. "Get under the bed," Adrian ordered, his voice a harsh, tactical whisper. "Now." Rachel scrambled beneath the heavy timber frame of the bed just as the first shot rang out. The sound was deafening. A heavy caliber bullet tore through the wooden window shutter, shattering the glass and burying itself in the stone hearth, raining dust over the floor. Bancroft hadn't sent the sheriff. He had hired regulators from the Leadville mining camps, ruthless, blood-hungry mercenaries who specialized in removing claim jumpers. The blizzard was their cover. They knew the law wouldn't come looking until the spring thaw. Adrian moved like a phantom. He kicked the heavy oak table onto its side, creating a barricade. He kicked the door open just a fraction and shoved the barrel of the Winchester through the crack. 3 rapid shots thundered from his rifle. A scream echoed over the howling wind outside. "McCoy!" a voice roared from the blinding snow. "We got 10 rifles out here. Bancroft sent us for the deed and the girl. Send her out, and we'll leave you to your mountain." "Come take her!" Adrian roared back. A volley of gunfire erupted. Bullets tore into the thick logs of the cabin, splintering wood and filling the air with acrid smoke. Rachel clamped her hands over her ears, praying in the dark beneath the bed. Adrian fired relentlessly, the lever action of his rifle a blur of mechanical precision. He was a force of nature, entirely without fear, but he was fighting blind into a storm against superior numbers. Suddenly, a massive boom rocked the cabin. One of the regulators had made it to the porch and fired a double-barrel shotgun point blank through the splintered window. Adrian let out a sharp, breathless grunt and was thrown violently backward against the wall. His rifle clattered to the floor. "Adrian!" Rachel screamed, crawling out from under the bed. He was slumped against the logs, his left arm hanging uselessly, dark blood rapidly staining his heavy wool shirt. The regulators were cheering outside, hearing him fall. Boots were thumping heavily onto the wooden porch. They were coming in. Adrian looked up at Rachel, his face pale, his breath ragged. He nodded toward the shotgun, resting against the far wall. "Rachel," he gasped, his eyes burning with a desperate, terrifying light. 4 buckshot shells in my coat pocket. Load it. Rachel had never fired a gun in her life. She was a seamstress, a merchant's daughter. But she looked at the blood pooling beneath Adrian, the man who had traded his solitary peace to save her life. She stood up, grabbed the heavy, double-barrel shotgun, and dug into his coat. Her blood-stained, salved hands loaded the shells with shaking, frantic speed. She cocked both hammers back, the mechanical clicks sounding impossibly loud in the brief lull of the storm. She stepped over Adrian, planting her feet, and aimed the heavy barrels directly at the oak door just as the iron latch began to lift. The heavy iron latch of the cabin door violently gave way, the wood splintering inward with a deafening crack. The wind howled through the breach, driving a wall of white snow and freezing air into the dim room. A massive figure stepped through the threshold, a heavy Sharps rifle raised to his shoulder. Rachel didn't hesitate. She didn't close her eyes. She aimed at the center of the intruder's chest and pulled the right trigger. The recoil of the double-barrel shotgun was monstrous. It kicked like a wild stallion, throwing Rachel backward onto the hard wooden floorboards. The roar in the confined space was absolute, ringing in her ears, followed instantly by a sickening, wet thud. Through the acrid, blinding cloud of gray gunsmoke, she saw the regulator blown completely off the porch, his rifle clattering onto the snow. "Get back!" a voice screamed from the darkness outside. "The girl's armed!" Tracker and Bone, Adrian's massive wolf dogs, seized the moment. With a synchronized, terrifying snarl, the 2 beasts launched themselves through the open doorway into the blizzard. The sounds that followed were the stuff of nightmares, the frantic firing of revolvers, the desperate screams of grown men, and the savage, tearing growls of apex predators defending their territory. From the floor, Adrian pushed himself up on his good arm. His face was entirely devoid of color, sweating profusely despite the freezing air pouring into the room. He reached for his Colt revolver with his right hand, his eyes burning with a dark, primal fury. "Close the door," Adrian rasped, coughing up a fleck of blood. "Rachel! The door!" Rachel scrambled to her feet, her shoulder throbbing violently from the shotgun's recoil. She threw her weight against the heavy oak door, pushing against the howling wind. It slammed shut, and she dropped the heavy iron bar into place, effectively sealing them back in. Outside, the gunfire became sporadic, then ceased entirely. The regulators, broken by the shotgun blast and mauled by the wolf dogs, were retreating down the treacherous, storm-battered mountain. They wouldn't survive the descent in the dark. Rachel dropped to her knees beside Adrian. He was bleeding profusely from his left shoulder, the heavy buckshot having torn through the thick wool of his coat and deep into the muscle. The legendary mountain man was fading fast. "We have to stop the bleeding," Rachel said, her voice shaking but her hands moving with frantic purpose. She grabbed a clean flour sack from the pantry and began to tear it into long strips. "Adrian, stay with me." "Fire," he muttered, his eyelids drooping. "Build up the fire, knife, on the table. Heat it." The next hour was a grueling descent into hell. Rachel stoked the hearth until it roared, placing Adrian's hunting knife into the glowing embers. She poured a generous measure of raw, biting whiskey over his open wound, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. When the blade was glowing orange, she pressed it to the torn flesh to cauterize the bleeding. Adrian didn't scream, but he bit completely through his lower lip, finally passing out from the sheer, blinding agony. For 3 days, the blizzard raged, effectively entombing them. Rachel barely slept. She fed the fire, boiled snow for water, and changed Adrian's bandages. She sat by his side as the fever took him, listening as the terrifying giant muttered deliriously about cavalry charges and the ghosts of Glorieta Pass. On the 4th morning, the wind finally broke. The morning sun pierced through the shattered window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Adrian opened his eyes. They were clear, the fever broken. He looked at Rachel, who was asleep in the wooden chair beside him, her head resting on the edge of his pallet, her hand lightly gripping his right arm. He didn't move. For the first time in years, Adrian McCoy felt something entirely alien to his solitary existence, an overwhelming, terrifying tenderness. When spring finally broke the icy grip of the Rockies, The thaw brought a reckoning to Oakhaven. Jeremiah Bancroft sat in his opulent bank office, savoring a glass of imported bourbon. The regulators had never returned from Blackwood Ridge, presumed lost in the storm. Bancroft assumed Adrian and Rachel had starved or frozen to death. The timber deed was practically his. The heavy glass doors of the bank swung open. Bancroft looked up, and the glass of bourbon slipped from his fingers, shattering on the imported rug. Adrian McCoy stood in the doorway. He looked thinner, a brutal scar visible on his neck, his left arm held in a sling, but his icy eyes were as lethal as ever. Beside him stood Rachel, wearing a new, well-made coat, her head held high, no longer the terrified girl he had threatened months ago. But they were not alone. Flanking them were 3 men in dark suits. "Jeremiah Bancroft," said the man in the center, pulling back his coat to reveal a silver star and pulling a folded document from his breast pocket. "I am James McParland, Chief Detective of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, working under the authority of Territorial Governor Pitkin. I hold a warrant for your arrest." Bancroft's face turned to ash. "On what charges?" "Embezzlement, fraud, and the attempted murder of Adrian and Rachel McCoy," McParland stated flatly. During the long winter months of recovery, Adrian had detailed everything to Rachel. He wasn't just an illiterate savage. He was an educated veteran who had seen the rot in Oakhaven long before Rachel's father died. Adrian had sent a letter via a trusted fur trader to Denver months ago, detailing Bancroft's illicit land grabs and asking for a federal audit. The regulators' attack was the final nail in Bancroft's coffin. "You can't do this!" Bancroft shrieked as the Pinkerton men hauled him to his feet, snapping heavy iron cuffs around his wrists. "That land is mine!" Adrian walked slowly toward Bancroft, the heavy spurs on his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. He stopped inches from the ruined banker. "The land belongs to my wife," Adrian said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "and you will never set foot in our valley again." As they watched Bancroft being dragged out into the muddy street, a spectacle for the entire town, Rachel turned to her husband. The monster of Oakhaven looked down at her, the harsh lines of his scarred face softening into a rare, genuine smile. "Ready to go home, Mrs. McCoy?" Adrian asked. Rachel smiled back, taking his good arm. "Lead the way, Mr. McCoy." The legend of Adrian and Rachel McCoy became a cornerstone of Colorado history. What began as a desperate plea in the freezing mud transformed into a lifelong partnership built on fierce loyalty and mutual survival. Bancroft's empire crumbled to dust, but the McCoy timberlands remained untouched for generations. It all started because a cornered woman risked everything, and a feared mountain man answered with 4 simple words.
Hi, my name is Ivy Duck Devotion, the owner and manager of Ivy Duck Devotion. After watching the video, she asked the most feared mountain man in town to marry her. He said 4 words back. "I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel?" What stayed with me most was the quiet vulnerability underneath the tough exterior. Sometimes, the people who seem the hardest to reach are carrying the deepest fears, and one honest moment can completely change the direction of a life. I also liked how the story reminded us that courage doesn't always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply being willing to trust someone when it will be easier to stay guarded. Have you ever met someone who surprised you once you got to know them better? And do you think people can really leave their past behind when someone believes in them? Stories like this make me think about how often we judge others too quickly without knowing what they've been through. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed these kinds of emotional mountain man stories, feel free to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing more together.